Richard's had to cancel because he's not feeling great, so sadly, but we have David Mack. Big cheer for David Mack.
David Mack!
And a big cheer for the legend that is Klaus Janson. So we're going to start by asking some questions, and then we're going to open up to the audience. So I guess I want to start to talk about the last 30 years of comics, how it's changed. So we'll start with you, David, and we'll move on to Klaus. So it's a big question.
Yeah.
But yeah, please.
Yeah. Should I hold
Yes,
this?
please hold the mic.
So I guess it's about almost 30 years exactly that I've been doing it professionally. Yeah, so I just had a birthday yesterday.
Oh.
But my very first.
You're really gonna milk it.
I know. Yeah.
Happy birthday, David.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So.
Is it 21 again?
21 forever!
Yeah, so it was probably maybe like 1990 that I got my first paying comic work, and I use that term loosely, paying.
What was it? What was the first job, David, or first professional comic gig?
I'm not going to tell you what the title is.
Was it Caliber? Was it pre?
Yeah, it was.
It was
before that.
Caliber.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you about the super early stuff, so you don't go look at it. Because it's horrible. It's not going to be helpful to you to find it anyway. But yeah, like he mentioned Caliber. That was like the first. It was an indie publisher, but it was like the biggest indie publisher I was working at the time. And I was working on a creator-owned series called Kabuki that I was publishing while I was in college. So the early '90s for me were it's so different now because this was before the internet in any practical form. It was before email, before Starbucks. Before laptops.
It
was completely different.
Pages were
before FedEx.
Yeah. Was it before FedEx? How would you send pages?
It's before I knew of FedEx.
Yeah.
They probably had it, right? Airborne Express, I think, was the popular one back then. Yeah.
I remember Airborne Express.
Yeah. But I would take like any. What I did back then is I went to the comic shop and I poured through all the independent comics and got the addresses, and then put my artwork in the mail to all these independent comic shops, and then I called them. And what are you talking about? And I sent this. I did this Kabuki. I sent Kabuki to Caliber Comics, among many others, and then called them. And then Caliber said, "Oh, we never saw that. We don't know what you're talking about. But it sounds interesting. Send it to us again." And so that was like the world was very clunky back then of how you had to like make connections and stuff. And that's kind of how I would get work, sending things in the mail.
So were you based in Kentucky?
Is
that where you
I
grew
grew
up?
up in Kentucky, yeah.
Okay, so
That's
obviously
it
it's an unusual, well, not unusual, but it's a kind of place that's kind of out of the way. Was it difficult for you to write? I'm being very classical here, should we say? Was it difficult for you to write comics?
We used candles.
And horses.
Yeah, we had a horse and buggy.
Carriage.
Yeah, I would use the horse and buggy to go to the.
And obviously, you saw electricity first, many years later.
We went to the well to fetch the water.
Yes. But no, so getting comics, was it difficult to get comics when you were growing up?
So I stumbled, maybe I was like 10 years old, and I was in a pharmacy, a drugstore, and they had a spinner rack of comics. Yeah. And I picked up, it was maybe like 1982 or something. I didn't know where comics came from. Like every now and then I would see them, but then I saw them in the spinner rack. And so we got 2 comics, and my brother and I read them, and it was like magic to us. And we kept coming back every single day to this pharmacy, asking the guy when the next, finally he was like, they only come out once a month. Stop coming in here every day, And then I realized, and I was at a friend's house, and this was maybe 1981, 1982. He had Daredevil, I think maybe 181. Wow. It was the one with the Punisher and Daredevil on the cover with the concentric circles. And it was I was about 9 years old. It was my introduction to Klaus Janson and my introduction to Daredevil. And
You guys are drunk, right?
But the interesting thing was, I was like 9 years old, so that story, I don't know if you guys remember this story, but It wasn't what I imagined.
Expected, no, of course.
Yeah, it wasn't what I imagined superhero comics were. Like there was a character dressed up as like a devil, and there was another guy with a skull on his chest, just murdering people, and there were children who were dealing drugs and committing suicide on drugs. You remember that a girl jumped out the window of her elementary school because she was high in angel dust.
That's right.
And then this guy with a skull on his chest is murdering the drug dealers who are also children, and he's the Punisher. And then a guy with horns starts beating him up. And it was really outside my comfort zone. It was really a visceral experience to me, and I couldn't exactly. But it's very.
And you were 8 or 9 years old.
I was 8 or 9. It was. But I couldn't understand why it had such a good effect on me. And then miraculously, a few years later, I was at a secondhand store called St. Vincent de Paul, and I stumbled upon the exact next issue. It's the one where Daredevil's pointing a gun at, it says, "No more Mr. Nice Guy."
Wow.
But it's the exact next issue, right? So 3 years later, then whatever I am, 12 years old or something, I was able to consciously process it a little better, and I was able to see why it had such an effect on me. And I was able to see the intelligence behind the design of the panels and the shadows and the lighting and the size of and shape of the panels. And I was able to process that and see like the magic behind it, and how the creators of this book were using like the weather, the lighting, everything to their advantage to tell the story. And I was just so fascinated because I was so affected by it at 9, and then 12 could see why I was. And then it made me want to do it, And that was like that.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it was you and Frank that made that magic for me, made me want to do it.
Yeah. Klaus, I was going to ask you. Obviously, you grew up in Germany, but you moved to the US when you were in your teens.
No,
Am I right?
I immigrated when I was 5.
Oh, you were quite young. Okay,
So,
interesting. You were quite little when.
I went to kindergarten in Germany and 1st grade in the United States.
So, I mean, in terms of your first experiences with comics, what were the first comics that you read as a kid?
I couldn't speak the language. I couldn't read it. I couldn't understand it. So I wandered into a real classic mom and pop shop that was about a half a block away from the place where we lived. And, they sold cigars, candy, and comic books. And that was it. And dust. They also sold a lot of dust.
So you were high on cigars.
That's right.
To this day, he always has to eat candy and smoke cigars.
Of course. It's what keeps me going. They had a wooden kind of clumsy rack, and it was full of DC comics. This was in the late 50s, so I'm a little older than David, and I started to just read them and put the images together with the words. And I think that in a lot of ways that was such a profound effect on me that I was able to understand the story without understanding the words. And I carry that with me, the power of images, the efficacy of images, and how incredibly important clear storytelling is, and storytelling that has subtlety or doesn't need subtlety. So I was deeply, deeply affected by that. But that was my first exposure. I'll tell you that when my mom retired and she sold the house, the last house that we lived in, I had curried away all of my comics that I had accumulated since I was a kid. And so I went up into the attic and I was pulling out all these boxes, and I thought, oh man, I'm sure there's going to be like a gold mine here, like Batman, and Superman stuff. And they were all Lois Lane comics.
So Klaus, what was your first professional gig as an artist?
My first professional gig, let me say semi-professional, which is that I worked for about a year as Dick Giordano's assistant.
Of course, I remember reading that.
And I had met, I read in a comic book that DC did tours, So I took it upon myself I got dressed up, I got duded up.
Wow.
And I was living in Connecticut, and I went to New York, and I knocked on the door of DC, and there was a very, very nice receptionist. And she said, what do you want? And I said, I'm here for the tour. And she said, well, we don't do tours anymore. And I'll never forget what I said. She said, we don't do tours anymore. And I looked at her and I said, but I'm wearing a tie. I mean, don't you see? So she called in. She said she felt sad for me and took pity on me. And she said, let me see what I can do. And she went in the back in editorial and she pulled out Jack Miller, who at the time was an editor at DC and doing Dead Man, which was one of my favorite books at that time. And I guess Jack, had a little bit of free time, so he came out and he gave me a tour. And I met Dick Giordano among a couple of other people, Carmen Infantino, and Neil Adams was working on a cover, and he was nice enough to let me sit and watch him. And Dick recognized me, and he said, when we were introduced, he said, I know you. And I said, how do you know me? And it was from all the letters that I had written to Charlton. So, never say that that's a waste of time.
Yeah.
And it turns out that Dick lived in the town next to me. I lived in Bridgeport, he lived in Stratford. And he knew that, I think probably through my letters, that I wanted to be an artist. And if it wasn't for that, I must have told him. And he said, come visit me. So I started being his assistant, like a year or two later, for about a year. But then I broke away and I moved to New York because I really hated Connecticut. I hated Bridgeport. And I wanted to live in New York where all the cool people live and also where DC and Marvel were.
Nice.
So that was, and my first gig was inking Rich Buckler over the Black Panther.
Wow.
Which they used actually for the movie. A lot of the scenes from that first issue they used for the first Black Panther movie, which I was, very pleased with.
Cool. So, who was the first creator that you knew the name of? Because when you're a kid, you're reading comics, you don't really know who does these things. Who was the first creator? So, Klaus, we'll start with yourself.
I think it would have to be besides David Mack.
Oh, cool.
I think it would have to be really Neil Adams.
Yeah.
Neil Adams.
Neil Adams was like, at that time, I mean, it was just a little bit before your time, but Neil Adams was like an earthquake. It changed everything.
Yes.
And nothing was the same after Neil. And he was so identifiable, he was so revolutionary, he was so big, he was just so profoundly different. And he stood out because of that. And I think, it's an interesting thing. Somebody once told me that to have an identifiable style is apparently a good thing in terms of commerce and your career. I'm not sure if that's true, but I think that's been helpful to me.
Well, it was interesting though, because at that, when you're young, you don't really think about that at first until it hits you over the head when you notice it. Then you start thinking about that.
What was the first guy that?
It was the first one you could name. When you're a kid, you looked at the Daredevil and thought this is great. But did you know that it was, Klaus and Frankie was doing this when you were a kid?
Well, when I was little, I was fascinated to read the credits. I did love that they had the credits, and then a few years later, when I was old enough to get that, I saw your names, and then I did two things. I wanted more comics and didn't know where they magically would appear next, so I looked in the Yellow Pages, which is before there was Google. You would in the Yellow Pages. I looked up comic books, and I found out there was a comic book store that sold back issues.
Amazing.
So I went to the store when I was, whatever it was, 12, 10. And there was a comic book back issue store, and I wanted those other Daredevil issues, and I also found that you could find comic books at the flea market. And I found this book called the Daredevil Chronicles, which was an interview conducted by Peter Sanderson with you and
Who is
Frank
here?
Miller.
Who is indeed in the audience. Peter's here.
So thank you, Peter. So young 12-year-old me read Peter Sanderson's interview with Frank Miller and Klaus Janson, and I could already see that the thought behind the storytelling that was going in it. But now I got to read at length the two of you discussing your thought process and your thought process about like when Bullseye was there was a bottle of liquor Bullseye had on the table. It was unusually large, and you said that's because you're showing like how important it is or what weight it has in the situation. Right. And so it gave me a sense that things don't have to be, they can be a certain amount of surrealism or a certain amount of metaphorical approach to the size or scale of things based on the weight it has in the story, right? And you were talking about like your inking, your lighting, your backlighting, your double lighting. It really gave me a sensitivity to this kind of thought that I wasn't thinking about, right?
That's just so sweet.
And there was also a moment where someone says to Klaus, Peter says to Klaus, Klaus, it seems like you really have like an identifying connection with Daredevil. And I was very young, so I didn't really understand humor or sarcasm. and then Frank Miller interjects in the interview and says, well, not many people know this, but Klaus is blind. And so I was like, wow, what an amazing inker. How does he, and he's blind. Wow, this guy is incredible. Do you remember this at all?
I don't remember that.
Yeah. Is that true?
That's the interview that I was reading, right?
Wow.
As a 12-year-old. But you both also discussed your influences, and Neil Adams was discussed as also like someone who not only influenced Bill Sienkiewicz, but brought Frank into the business.
Absolutely.
Wow.
But also Will Eisner was discussed at length. And that's the first time I ever heard of Will Eisner. So because I heard of Will Eisner, I then looked up the comics and sequential art book, which at that time you could buy from the publisher through the mail, which I did, and then studied that because you and Frank talked about it.
Amazing.
Cool, that's amazing.
Wow.
You're making me take a trip back.
Wow.
It's that passage that you refer to. Here's a secret about the big liquor bottle on that page. I know what page you're talking about.
Yes.
It was just bad drawing.
No! Klaus, what?
And Peter asks us a question.
No.
And we're tap dancing. We're just going, it means this,
No way.
Oh, that's funny.
Well, there was enough useful information to make it work.
What David is talking about is when you talk about all the lighting and the page layout and everything else. One of the things that I try to emphasize, and please tell me, what you think about this, David, that I think there's such a small amount of real estate on a page.
Right.
The page is not very big at all. It's really quite small and compact and tight.
You have to be very economical with your choices.
That is correct, and largely because of that, and also because of the needs of storytelling and the need to be clear and effective in your storytelling, everything has meaning on a page.
Right.
So even
Everything has a count.
Pardon me?
Everything has a count.
Yes, everything has a consequence. Everything has a meaning, and all of your decisions have to be thought out, from the most innocuous, inane things to the most important stuff. And when we talk about that liquor bottle, I've often found that in working and in drawing, that you may not necessarily do something consciously sometimes, and then you realize, this is what this means, and especially in terms of to me and to my storytelling. So we were tap dancing when we answered that, but it was very, very.
But at that time in Klaus's life, he drew large liquor bottles. But he's improved with his drinking management.
Yes, exactly.
They become smaller.
They're smaller now. They're more compact.
Yes, I've been sober 25 minutes.
25 minutes!
Well, I mean,
Dude, come on,
that's pretty good. It was harder for us to get comics in England. I mean, they were there was this thing called non-distributed, so they were like 2 months old. If you go into the newsagents to buy them, but one of the first comics I saw, I think, was New Teen Titans by Marv Wolfman and George Perez, and it was, you know, I got into it, I was instantly hooked. And it was my brother's fault that I got into comics, because he had a friend who was stuck in hospital, and he was given some Superman books, and my brother was a Marvel reader, and you know, I was a DC. I didn't get to Daredevil until many, many years later, and it's still one of my favourite runs.
Wow.
Yours and Frank's is a magnificent.
Woo!
It's a fabulous piece of work.
Beautiful.
And it's just the thing I like about it is the economy of the writing, and also the art as well. But it's just everything works in concert. So it's so brilliant. You read this stuff and you think, wow, you managed to pack so much into such a small amount of panels, and it's, you know, it's about the economy, you know, of the art, and also of the writing, and you know, the characterization is magnificent, and it's just such a great run. It's such a fantastically consistent run. You know, and it's such an honour to have you here. Seriously,
Thanks.
Yes!
I was going to ask you something, David.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Was it about our collaboration?
Yes.
Oh, End of Days?
So yeah.
Of course, yes, we need to talk about it. Yes, of
And
course.
the days too.
Hey!
So, you know, in addition to being inspired by, you know, Frank and Klaus's collaborations on Daredevil, I was also inspired and moved by Frank and Bill Sienkiewicz's Daredevil story, Love and War, but also Elektra.
Sure.
And Brian Bendis also, who'd been my friend for the last 30 years as well. And we eventually, Brian and I co-wrote a Daredevil story in which Klaus and Bill Sienkiewicz did the art. It's called Daredevil End of Days.
It was a fantastic story. It was
Woo!
amazing. Seriously, it was a great
agree.
run.
It was the best script that I've ever had.
Wow.
Well, could you say that again? And you worked on Dark Knight Returns, right?
That is correct.
Yeah, but no one remembers
Wait, one more
that.
time, Klaus.
What's remarkable about that statement, that it was the best script I've ever had, is that was already 15 years ago, 20 years ago?
It was coming out in 2012, in 2013, but we've been working on it for a few years. You're right. It might have been 15 years when we started writing it.
Well,
I think you're right.
But I think it shows.
It was maybe like 2006 when we started writing it. Yeah.
Or certainly talking about
Something
it.
like that. Yeah.
But it shows how remarkably difficult it is to achieve, you know, high level of art in your work.
It's about consistency. It's about being consistent with your work.
Yeah, and it's about collaboration, and it's about the moment.
Yes.
You know, the Daredevil with Frank is never going to be repeated.
No.
That was a certain
Time in your
period.
lives,
Yeah,
basically.
absolutely.
Yes.
You know, you're never going to get. I don't know. I don't want to compare it, but you're never going to get another Sergeant Pepper. You know.
Sure.
if
Well,
there's
this book though, it was all the people who worked on
End
it.
of Days.
Yeah,
Yeah.
had all dedicated a large chunk of their careers to working on Daredevil, and now we're able to all work on it together. And it kind of acknowledged all of those eras of everybody, and you know, assimilated it to a certain
That's
degree.
right.
There were certain nods
Yeah.
to all of the eras of Daredevil that we could fit in there, right? You know,
That is
from even the earliest and goofiest moments
Yes.
to, you know, to
It was
the
wonderful.
grittiest moments
Yeah, it was
and to the
wonderful.
most surreal moments. There were all kind of nods to that in there, but there were several levels of satisfaction because, you know, also, you know, Brian and I grew up reading you and Bill and your work on the work you did. So it was an incredible experience for us to be able to collaborate with you guys, and then for you to come back and say, and Klaus was like, everybody was on their A game when they were doing it, and
of
Klaus
course,
would
of
come back and everyone was putting a lot of thought into it.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, you know, on page, you know, 20, you have it, you know, this is a 6-panel page, but Klaus would say, what if I take this panel and turn it into 2 panels
David,
doing
was
this?
it written Marvel style or DC style script?
No, it was
It was a script.
it was
a full script.
It was a full script. Yeah. I mean, you know, Brian and I collaborated on it in a unique way, but we turned it into that was a collaboration too. But by the time Klaus and Bill got it, it was a full script with you know, panels per page, and then, you know, all the details of what the sound effects and everything, and the action and the text for each panel. But Klaus would come back.
I still have those.
Oh, you do? Okay, good. And Klaus would say like, oh, you know, what if I do this? And we were delighted because we were like, first of all, we love that he's putting, you know, this extra thought into it. Yes. But also, it was almost like he was almost like, hey, are you okay if I do this? And we were like, you know, we kind of learned from you anyway, Klaus and Bill. Like, you guys do whatever you want. You know, it was really fun.
Woo! Yeah, I was going to ask Klaus. Obviously, the Daredevil run, which I want to talk about again, was a magnificent run, and obviously Frank's work was amazing. But I felt like when you collaborated with yourself, you kind of took things up to another level, you know, in terms of